So how much better is the RTX 4090? And we're gonna go way beyond just bar graphs and percentages. We'll get percentages, but we're gonna be looking at head-to-head comparisons, sometimes apples to apples, sometimes adjusting settings to realistic ones you'd actually use in the game. What sort of image quality compromises does the 3090 Ti have to make in terms of more aggressive DLSS, less ray tracing, that kinds of things. At different resolutions, we'll even look at ultra-wide here, since I think a lot of ultra-wide enthusiasts get a little left out of certain benchmarks. Now, when you're watching my benchmarks, I've noticed sometimes people talk about this one looks more stuttery than the other one. Remember, the games were running at variable refresh rate on variable refresh rate display, but the image was captured using their driver software and then is encoded at 60 frames per second for you, so the footage might look more stuttery in the video than it did in real life. Look at the frame time graphs up here. That's what they're for. A smoother frame time graph would be very stutter-free in actual experience. You can also see the actual FPS numbers throughout the benchmark. You can keep an eye on the GPU temperatures. The cooler models here is a Founders Edition 3090 Ti at its out-of-the-box settings, and the 4090 is actually the Gigabyte Gaming OC model at its out-of-the-box settings. So those are the cooler models, and then you can take a look at what power draw is up there. And some people get confused on VRAM versus RAM here. So the CPU stuff is coded in blue, so there's the CPU and the system RAM. In green, we have the GPU and the GPU memory, if you want to take a look at that. Now, the system we're using here is my Ryzen 9 5950X, which is a 32 thread, 16-core CPU, which sometimes can be CPU limited, but not in many of these tests. I'll point out when it is, and we will, but most of these tests are not going to be CPU limited. It's 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL16 memory. Let's hop into the benchmarks. I'll give you some more thoughts at the end. So many major franchises have announced they're switching over to Unreal Engine 5 for future entries. It has stunning lighting using Lumen, and you can get incredibly close to highly detailed objects. Look at the fruit here in a second with the Nanite system. However, benchmarking it right now is a little tough because we don't have big major releases out right now. So I'm using the Market of Light, which you can find on Steam. This was built using an early access version of Unreal Engine 5. And it doesn't really have adjustable graphics settings or anything like that, so we're just running it at 4K. So in reality, I'm sure the 3090 Ti, with some graphics settings turned down or using DLSS in an actual released game, we could get over 60 FPS. Notice that in this test, at its default settings, it's the 3090 Ti well below 60 FPS, the 4090 is comfortably above it, and we're seeing about a 49% lead for the 4090 over the 3090 Ti. Now, we're going to drop down to ultra-wide 1440p, so 3440 by 1440, and here we're seeing both of them comfortably over 60 FPS, although the 4090 is a very high refresh rate experience here. Now, I'll be using ultra-wide 1440p in this video instead of 1080p, which I don't think is a very realistic use case for these GPUs. I think the ultra-wide 1440p just makes a lot more sense here. Now, at this resolution, we're seeing about a 46% faster lead for the 4090 over the previous generation flagship. Now, dropping down to normal 1440p, we're seeing both GPUs delivering very good frame rate. So I mean, if you're using a 3090 Ti for 1440p and worried about performance in upcoming Unreal Engine 5 games, I mean, at least based on this Market of Light demo, I don't think you have anything to be worried about. But I think that, you know, it's not as high a refresh rate as we're getting from the 4090. I guess we'll leave it at that. And we're seeing about a 44% faster result in this scene, although I think we might be getting a little bit CPU limited there on the 4090. Now, jumping to not Unreal Engine 5, but a next-gen only game. This is a game that doesn't feature old generation consoles, and it is incredibly demanding. I believe the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series S only run this game at 1440p 30 FPS, although I think they have a unlocked mode that tries to target 40 and can't always hit it. I think that this will be more of the type of demand that we see from upcoming games as they start to lose support for the older generations. Now I'm using DLAA here rather than the TAA, so this is a little bit more demanding. And that's because the game was updated and I wasn't 100% sure the normal TAA was actually 100% resolution scale because of how they did the menus, which was a little bit annoying here, but we see a 50% faster result for the 4090, with the 4090 comfortably above 60 FPS and the 3090 Ti below. So this is similar to what we were seeing in the Unreal Engine 5 benchmark I was doing. However, this being an actual game means we could kick on DLSS, and we're seeing 50% faster for both, but now the 3090 Ti has a very comfortable frame rate, and 70s FPS range is great in this game. At ultrawide 1440p, we're seeing a 47% lead, and again, this is using DLAA, but the 3090 Ti is above 60 FPS at this resolution, so no problem there. And dropping down to normal 16:9 1440p, we're seeing 48% faster. And yeah, both GPUs doing a great job here. But again, the 4090 is well over 100 FPS, whereas the 3090 Ti is, comfortable. Dropping down to 1080p, we're getting a CPU limited on the 4090, and so only 34% faster here, which is again emphasizing why even in graphically demanding games, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at 1080p in this video. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 might not be Unreal Engine 5, and it might not be one of the newest demanding games, but while it came out a couple years ago, this game at its ultra settings is still incredibly demanding. But notice the 4090 is able to give us a high refresh rate experience at 4K Ultra. Now, there's no ray tracing here yet, whereas the 3090 Ti is dropping well below 60 FPS in the more demanding scenes here. Also, this is a good one for us to look at. Let's talk about the power draw. Both of these GPUs are drawing a lot of power, but the 4090 is actually using a little bit less and staying cooler. And these, whereas we're seeing, the performance significantly better from the 4090. So it is interesting to see what it's able to do with even less power on such a demanding game. So there is really interesting generation-on-generation efficiency gains here. I wonder what we'll see from a 4090 Ti. Anyway, we're seeing 48% faster results here, and the 4090 is the only one that's well above 60 FPS. However, you don't have to play games at Ultra. So the 3090 Ti, if you wanted to drop down to high settings and enable DLSS quality, you're now getting very good frame rates. I think you'd be very happy playing the game here. However, one thing I found was interesting here is if we just drop the 4090 down to high, but don't enable DLSS quality, the frame rates were very similar. And then with DLSS quality, we're still seeing that 50% advantage. So it was interesting how we could play it native there and match the performance of using DLSS on the 3090. Now here we're looking at ultrawide 1440p, and both of them are delivering good performance here at the native resolution. Obviously you could also use DLSS if you wanted to boost frame rates even higher, or drop down to high settings, or both, but I think both of them could just play the game at the native resolution here, and I think we would definitely be happy. We're seeing a 39% faster result for the 4090 versus the 3090 Ti in this benchmark, with 120 FPS on the 4090. Now, if you're using these for normal 16:9 1440p, they're both excellent GPUs, and here's where it's like, okay, obviously the 4090 is better, but the 3090 Ti hanging out around 90 FPS and going well over 100 FPS a lot of the time. I don't think you'd be upset here at all. Interestingly, the 4090 is actually dropping to even lower power usage and still about 49% faster in this test. Now, you could try to use ray tracing in this game, and at 4K resolution, well, you're not going to be at real 4K resolution on either GPU if you want to max out the ray tracing settings. If we use RT Ultra, you have to go to DLSS performance mode on the 3090 Ti to average around 60 FPS. The 4090 can go to RT Psycho with DLSS quality, and then you could use DLSS performance to get a high refresh rate experience. So seeing a few options here, and we're seeing a 61% lead at the matched settings, which is interesting, bigger gains on ray tracing than without. Now in this test, what we're looking at is realistic, kind of targeting around 60 FPS, how good of settings could you use? So on the 3090 Ti, we're going just RT reflections with DLSS quality, and other than that, at the Ultra preset. We can try that out on the 4090, but do it with native, and then 4K RT Psycho with DLSS quality is a possibility on the 4090. So interesting options. If you're playing at ultrawide 1440p and you want to use some ray tracing, well, the 3090 Ti is not going to be doing it for you at RT Ultra native. The 4090 is able to be around 60 FPS at RT Ultra at the native settings, but enabling DLSS quality gets the 3090 Ti to kind of match the performance of the 4090 without DLSS. But if the 4090, is able to go to DLSS quality, it's now delivering a high refresh rate experience. Now, unfortunately, in this game, I'm not a huge fan of DLSS on the aliasing of certain objects, but anyway, we're seeing 69% faster at native and 61% faster with DLSS there. So again, the ray tracing seems to be boosted even more than the non-ray trace performance gen on gen here. Here we're looking at 1440p ray tracing options. You could go RT Psycho with DLSS quality. But on the 3090 Ti, I'm also just showing what if we just played it at the native resolution with no ray tracing, and the 4090 we could go to RT Psycho at native. So interesting options, and at the like-for-like comparison there, we're seeing a 50% faster result. Could be some CPU limits at that, though, on the 4090. Now, on this test, I did decide to go down to 1080p, but just to test out maximum ray tracing, so RT Psycho, which is very difficult even for a 3090 Ti at 1080p, whereas the 4090 is at least giving us a high refresh rate experience here, although again, using 1080p on these GPUs, you might be seeking a super high refresh rate experience for esports and then also play some single player games, but maybe have one of those like 360 hertz or more 1080p monitors, something like that. I don't know. Let's drop down to an easier ray tracing title like Forza Horizon 5. This is the 4K extreme setting with TAA. However, I kicked on the ray tracing up to the extreme setting, and the game was updated recently to allow ray tracing in driving mode, not just in the Forza Vista car viewer mode. Now you can see here that the 4090 is actually CPU limited. If you look up at the GPU utilization, it's down in the 70 to 80% range at times, meaning the GPU is not able to be fully used because the CPU is holding it back. The CPU is reporting a low usage percentage because games can't usually use the 32 threads on my 5950X CPU. So it maxes out the threads that it can use and then is holding back the GPU. It's still a CPU limit because a faster CPU would allow the game to go faster, whereas a faster GPU wouldn't. You can look at the GPU limited percentage it reports there, where the 4090 was only 9.3% GPU limited in that test. Now from this point on, as noted here, I'm using slightly older tests I ran on my 4090. They're not that old, but it's not on the same driver version anymore. So just note that at this point, the driver version on the 4090 has changed. This is Guardians of the Galaxy with the RT set to max, and then we're looking at it with DLSS quality on as well as off. The ray tracing in this game can go from high to very high to ultra, and then you can also turn on ray trace transparencies. By RT Max, I've turned all of those on top of the default Ultra preset for the rest of the game. At native resolution with no DLSS, the 4090 is actually crushing it with 4K maxed out ray tracing settings, whereas the 3090 Ti is often well below 60 FPS, although once you turn on DLSS, it's pretty easy. This particular portion of the benchmark here at the end is very easy to run, so it kind of inflates the overall result when you look at the averages at the end here, but we're seeing 61% faster at native and 46% faster with DLSS, but I think DLSS was getting the 4090 fast enough frame rates that it became a little bit CPU limited there, causing a lesser performance gain. Here we're looking at the 4K Ultra settings without ray tracing, but also on the 4090 with the ray tracing completely maxed out, because I think on that GPU, it's delivering such good frame rates, it was worth kind of looking at the comparison. Although visually, all you're really going to get is better reflections, which are nice. And on the 4090, you definitely have the headroom to use it. Here we were only 29% faster at native, but it was definitely CPU limited because even at 4K, the frame rates were just so high. At 1440p, both GPUs are able to max out the game, including ray tracing with high enough frame rates that I don't think it's worth testing without ray tracing enabled, since even the 3090 Ti is a high refresh rate experience, and the 4090 is getting such high frame rates off the GPU that once again, we're seeing CPU limitations. You can see the GPU usage is not up around 100% on the 4090, so we're only about 27% faster here, but there was definitely some CPU limitations going on causing that. Now we're going to drop down to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This was one of the very first ray tracing titles, and it only features ray traced shadows, although you can adjust them to various settings. I've turned it all the way up to the Ultra setting here. And with no DLSS, the 3090 Ti is hanging out pretty well, you know, a lot of the times above 60 FPS comfortably. Sometimes it gets pretty close there, whereas the 4090 is a high refresh rate experience. We're also looking at it with ray tracing off, and by highest, I just mean that's the name of the preset in the game. It is the highest preset. Now, the results I'll show you at the end here are based on the full benchmark run I just showed you the first scene. We're seeing 71% faster here with the ray tracing on, which is much bigger gain than we saw in other games, which is interesting, but I've seen that in all my GPUs here, that this architecture really seems to like Shadow of the Tomb Raider compared to the previous architecture. Anyway, here we're looking at ultra-wide, and now we're looking at the highest and highest plus RT Ultra once again. And in this case, now even the 3090 Ti is delivering a pretty high refresh rate experience, even with the ray tracing completely maxed out. Now, also remember that you could use DLSS. You could also, instead of using RT Ultra, you could just use one of the lower ray tracing settings. But we're seeing 46% faster here with ray tracing off and 68% faster with RT Ultra. But there could be a little bit of CPU limitation there on the native result. Now here we're seeing 1440p, not ultra-wide, normal 16:9. The 3090 Ti is showing us with the without ray tracing as well as with ray tracing, but on the 4090, we're just looking at it with ray tracing because at this resolution, guys, it's around 200 FPS, even with ray tracing maxed out at 1440p. So yeah, the 4090 is absolutely crushing it. It's faster with ray tracing maxed out than the 3090 Ti is without the ray tracing, which is kind of interesting. We're seeing 58% faster with RT on, but it was actually somewhat CPU limited. Now, speaking of CPU limited, when I tested out Spider-Man Remastered at 4K very high, plus turning the ray tracing on to very high with the draw distances to 6, we're seeing that the 3090 Ti is getting most of its performance out. The GPU is nearly maxed out most of the time, but the 4090 is not maxed out. So we are running into CPU limits here, so I'm not going to really bother with the performance difference. Let's hop to a different game. I wanted to make sure that we tested out some DirectX 11. So God of War is a fairly recent DirectX 11 title. And here we're seeing the 3090 Ti and the 4090 delivering excellent performance here. I was interested to see if the 3090 Ti with DLSS would be able to catch up to the performance of the 4090 without DLSS, just kind of for fun, because I think in some games it seemed like it was helping it catch up, but in games like this one, it looks like it didn't. We're seeing 55% faster when we're comparing native to native here. So some games we're getting less than a 50% boost, and some games we're getting more. Now, jumping over to Horizon Zero Dawn, both GPUs are delivering excellent performance, and once again, we're seeing the game at its maximum preset on the 3090 Ti and the 4090 on the left and the right. Now, in the middle, I again tried out turning on DLSS quality for the 3090 Ti just to see how close to the performance of the 4090 we could get. And it's not completely catching it, but, you know, it's getting kind of close in certain scenes, although we could be getting a little bit CPU limited at times on the 4090 with a 45% lead when we're comparing the native resolutions. So let's go ahead and take a look at Red Dead Redemption 2. we're at 4K, and I've taken the overall graphics preset and slid it all the way to the right-hand side for favor quality. And once again, I've tried enabling DLSS quality on the 3090 Ti. Also, I've chose to run this game in Vulkan. You could also run it in DX12, but I wanted to make sure that we get a Vulkan test to see how the GPUs perform on different APIs. So just like I used God of War to get DX11, we're using Red Dead Redemption here to get Vulkan testing. Both GPUs are delivering excellent results, even at 4K native, and with the 3090 Ti kicking on DLSS quality, does awesome high refresh rate. We're seeing 47% faster result for the 4090 comparing the native resolutions. Now, dropping down to ultra-wide 1440p, I thought the 3090 Ti is doing so well here, I didn't even really see the point of enabling DLSS. And the 4090 is, you know, if you've got your 150 hertz, 165 hertz, 1440p ultra wide, you know, it's getting the job done for you. We're 46% faster than the 3090 Ti. And let's go ahead and take a look at normal 1440p non-ultra wide results, and the 3090 Ti is over 120 FPS most of the time, with the 4090 just getting CPU limited. Once again, we can see the GPU not being fully used, 41% faster overall at that resolution. Well, the 4090 is certainly better than the 3090 Ti, especially if you're interested in ray tracing. It wasn't uncommon to see around a 50% uplift in rasterized performance, but more like a 60% or better uplift in ray tracing performance, which is very impressive. So if you're interested in high resolution, especially with ray tracing, the 4090 is the best of the best right now. And it costs a price that reflects that. So here's the thing. If you are considering GPUs of either of these caliber, I mean, maybe you're looking at a used deal on a 3090 Ti that looks interesting, in which case these are just not in the same pricing class. So buy the GPU that makes the most sense to you. But if you're considering, you know, spending $2,000 or more on a GPU, which is where the 4090 is at right now, but you're like, should I just save the money on the 3090 Ti? I've got to say, guys, the 4090 does, if you're playing at 4K, deliver a noticeably better experience. In general, and this would apply even to lower tier GPUs, I think an upgrade is worth it and actually noticeable if it provides at least a 50% performance uplift. I'm not saying you don't notice uplifts when they're smaller than that, but I think if you spent a lot of money on a new graphics card and you didn't get at least a 50% performance uplift, you might not feel like it was worth making the huge switch and spending all of that money. But when you get a 50% or better performance uplift, which is what we're seeing here, I think it is a noticeable upgrade. So if people with a 3090 Ti who already spent a ridiculous amount on a GPU and want to do that again are thinking, is it really worth it jumping to the 4090? I think it is if you're playing at 4K. If you're playing below 4K, especially like 1440p, in that case, I think you need to look at, is it offering you a meaningfully different or better experience on the 4090? Because really the 3090 Ti can still deliver such a good experience at 1440p that I'm not sure the 4090 is going to be mind-blowingly better. It's just going to go from fast refresh rates to even faster refresh rates. The alarm's ringing on my phone, but we're just going to roll with it, guys. Anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is, if you already have a 3090 Ti and you're considering the upgrade, if you're at 4K and you're the kind of buyer where this amount of money to you is not that big of a deal on your favorite hobby, then I think it's worth it. If below that, up to you, might be worth skipping a gen, or maybe that 4090 Ti comes out at some point, because we will expect one of those. And hopefully, eventually, the prices on the 4090s do start to come back down to earth, or at least towards their MSRP. We'll see what happens. I hope all of you have an excellent day.